A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
This is Andrew McLennan. In an increasingly complex world, sadly, many are affected emotionally, mentally, socially, even financially through abuse and mistreatment at the hands of others. So it's always encouraging when a Christian stands up and speaks up about light shining into the darkness of people's world so that all of us can find healing and restoration through Jesus. And one of these people is Jason Summers, and he has written a book called Light Overcoming Darkness, and we welcome him now. Jason, welcome.
Thank you, Andrew. A real pleasure to be on the program.
Well, Jason, it's a great book you've written because it's a topic that really is for the world in which we live today with, I think mental health in Australia now is 20% of Australian adults are affected in some way negatively in their mental health. So this is a timely book for our generation, isn't it?
Indeed it is. And certainly it's one of the reasons why I wrote it was to speak words of meaning and help into our world that's very dark and broken.
Yeah, so I guess what motivated you to write this book, Light Overcoming Darkness?
Thanks, Andrew. Great question. There are a number of motivations. One of the motivation is what I've noticed in a world that is becoming increasingly secular is we've rubbed out forgiveness and mercy, and we don't have a paradigm for redemption anymore. And what I mean by that is the victim's always the victim, and the abuser's always the abuser. And to be a victim always, or always an abuser with no hope of redemption is misery. But of course, through Christ and the gospel, he liberates us from victimhood, both for the victim and the abuser. So I wanted to speak into our secular world that there is a way in which we can be freed from that terrible victimhood that so often people are trapped in.
That is such a good point because you're right. Our society tends to want to keep people as victims or perpetrators, and people leverage off that, don't they? Whether it be politicians or media personalities
Absolutely.
Or commentators, we can leverage off the misery of others because it's convenient for us to say, well, look, there's this group of victims, this group of victims, this group of victims. Oh, and by the way, our political party or our movement or our whatever it is helping these poor victims, as opposed to getting the victims to stand up, shake the dust off, find healing, find restoration, and actually move on with their lives and not be victims the rest of their life.
Absolutely. In fact, I think the term victim survivor is very cruel because the victim survivor is encouraged to stay in bitterness and resentment, seek retribution, and that's just misery. Christ liberates us from more than just being survivors, but being liberated lovers, really.
Oh, that's so well put. And so your message is it's very countercultural and it's obviously very biblical in, as you describe it so correctly, a secular world. But talk to me about what is the book about in a nutshell? Yeah,
great. It's not a self-help book and it's not a how-to manual. It's an account. It's a narrative. It's a story actually of my mum and dad. My mum especially suffered incredible abuse for the first 23 years in her life within a family. And I recount some of that abuse that she experienced, which is quite extreme. And then when she got married, she had a complete mental breakdown, a terrible mental breakdown. And my father, in his love and grace, took mum to a doctor, but unfortunately that doctor happened to be Dr. Harry Bailey. He's, quite frankly, Australia's worst serial killer. He didn't kill for pleasure, he just didn't care. And he was a psychiatrist who was experimenting on many, many people. And in fact, there was a Royal Commission in New South Wales concerning this doctor in the 80s. But that's the darkness of the story I retell. But I retell the darkness to show that the light of Christ liberated my mum and dad in such a way that they weren't defined by their trauma or their abuse, but they were defined by Christ and the gospel, and have lived a life of love and forgiveness and grace.
Amazing. Can I ask, how many years were they married before your mum had the breakdown?
Yeah, about 1.5 years. So they were just newly married, and this is in the 60s. So mental illness was if you admitted to mental illness, you were in a social exile. It was a different time to today, and the abuse my mum suffered was just extraordinary.
Yeah, so obviously she's been abused as a young person, and then getting married and entering into a deep, intimate relationship with another human, it's triggered a lot of that trauma, hasn't it? And that's where she's had the breakdown.
Yeah, because the nature of my mum's abuse in her growing up was emotional abuse. It was coercive control, and it was her stepmother. And so when my mum was married and outside of the control of my stepmother, she didn't know what to do and mentally just collapsed. So I talk quite a bit about coercive control and emotional abuse as well as medical malpractice.
Yeah, what a timely message for today, Jason. How did this story even come out? Did your mum volunteer a story to you? You just picked up bits and pieces and started quizzing her? Like, how did it happen?
Yeah, that's a great question because I have three brothers. We didn't know anything that happened to my mum as we were growing up. And the reason being is Mum and Dad weren't defined by their past trauma. They weren't looking back. Christ enabled them to look ahead. So we didn't know. We had little bits and pieces. We had little snippets. One day in 2002, my mum retold to me the story of how she sought to exercise love and forgiveness towards her stepmother. She sought to be reconciled and to really show her the grace of Christ in the most wonderful way. And when Mum retold me that story, I felt a conviction in my spirit that this is a story of redemption that I want to know more about. And I just wonder if this could be something God could use. It wasn't until 2020 that I actually sat down with my mum and dad and asked them to retell it. And then they told it in full. And at that point, I must say, I asked my mum and dad, I said, this is not my story to take, it's yours to give. Do you want to give this story? And they did, specifically to help people who have suffered in those ways, to show a vision of what Christ can do.
Amazing. Are your mum and dad still with us now, Jason?
They are. They live in Port Macquarie, New South Wales, and they certainly are still with us.
And I'm guessing your mum's got a real sense of satisfaction and that her story is now going to help a lot of other people?
Yes, I can sum it up like this. My youngest brother, after we had a book launch for books, asked my mum and said, Mum, how do you feel about everybody knowing your story? And Mum said, you know what, I hadn't thought about that, Paul. And they laughed. But then Mum said to Paul, if this book helps just one person, then it's all worth it, and that's what I want. So Mum and Dad, you're right. They have a great sense of joy that out of all the evil, God has turned it for good, because the vision of God's liberation and forgiveness and love that they've experienced it's a miracle, and there's one open for us all.
Yeah, absolutely. And did you have to go on a journey of education yourself, Jason, to understand coercive control and emotional abuse?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, the amount of research, I certainly spent hundreds and hundreds of hours. Everything in the book is accurate historically, even the incidental things, because I wanted people to feel like they're there, because I narrate the story. It's a story. It's not, again, a how-to manual. So absolutely, not only that, I had to investigate Dr. Harry Bailey and the Chelmsford Hospital in Sydney, where I'm not sure if you're aware, but that's where patients were placed under what we call deep sleep therapy. Dr. Bailey would put people into a coma without any of the medical instruments you need to look after somebody and give them daily ECT and would wipe their memories. 24 people died under his treatment. 4 people died before my mum got there. And many people were left injured and many committed suicide. It's a dreadful story. But I had to go into all that. And I must say, I wept a lot over this story. I wept and wept when I saw my dear mum went through. But to see the light of what mum and dad experienced in Jesus has been really the highlight for me.
Yeah, that is terrible. I hadn't, the name sort of rings a bell, Harry Bailey, but I didn't know these details. 24 people died in his care. That is terrible.
Well, that's directly, because indirectly, the people who had the treatment, which we call DST, deep sleep therapy, if you compared his patients, those who had it and those who didn't, those who had it were twice as likely to commit suicide. And people were brain damaged. People had nerve damage. They had terrible thrombosis and headaches, and the side effects and the guilt that families experienced. It was dreadful, and that's why the government actually went kicking and screaming, but conducted a royal commission into it.
Yeah, that would be very difficult to be studying that, knowing that your mum was one of the poor people that had to endure that so-called treatment.
Heartbreaking, yeah.
Yeah, but was your mum always a Christian, or did she find faith later in life?
Yeah, thank you. She went to church, so she knew about God, and she had a measure of faith. But this is why I wrote the story. After Bailey conducted his final experiment on her, which, by the way, was to operate on her brain, because he believed you could go into the brain and cauterize healthy tissue, nerve endings, and it would free her. So a lot of people were maimed through that. But after he did that, Mum came through, and God healed her in a mighty way. She went to church not long after that. She heard the gospel, and it was like she said her eyes were opened. She saw everything differently, and that's what enabled her to love those who abused her. And it's through forgiveness, forgiving all those people, that she was freed. So she came to faith at the end of all the darkness, and that made such a difference in her life. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, incredible testimony and very encouraging. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners have either personally experienced something like that, or maybe they know someone, or they're related to someone. As I said in the introduction earlier, there's such a complexity to our society today. There's a lot of people carrying emotional and mental wounding and trauma and moral injuries. And it's so good to see a story like this that has such hope and faith at the end of it, and healing.
That's exactly right. That's the whole point of a story. We outline the darkness to show that the light overcomes it. And it really is a story we pray will lead people to experience the liberation that comes in Christ when we forgive and when we don't resent the injuries people have inflicted upon us, and we're liberated to love. And that's what we want to try to lead people to see.
Excellent. And you've got some good forwards here from the Deputy Premier of Tasmania, which is where you live. You live in one of the greatest parts of the world. He's written a really good forward, as did Gary Miller, the principal of the Queensland Theological College. So this book comes highly recommended. Now, let our listeners know where they can find this book, Jason.
Yeah, they can. You can purchase it online through reformersbookshop.com.au. They're an online bookshop that's based in Sydney, but will send out to everywhere. They're a great bookshop. Petrarch's Books, which is based in Launceston, but they're online as well. It is also available through a publisher called Ida Books, and you'll be able to purchase it through them. It's also an e-book on the major platforms and an audio book. So if you like to listen to books, it's an audio book as well.
And they've just got to search up Light Overcoming Darkness, Light Overcoming Darkness, and the author is Jason Summers. It sounds like a cracking book, Jason. I sincerely wish you all the best with it. I pray many, 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 many people read and digest and process this book and find the same amount of healing and restoration as your mum did on her journey of faith with Jesus.
Thanks, Andrew. That's much appreciated, and that's my heart desire too.
Okay, Jason, we'll talk to you again.
Thanks for having me. A real pleasure to talk today, Andrew.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.